Migration Summit. I'm so happy to have you here today. Before I begin and talk about the summit, I'm going to talk about this song for 30 seconds. This song was written by one of our organizing committee members, Marike, with one of our refugee learners. She sort of turned Patricia's story to a song. So this is a very, very special song for us, and it talks about, how she feels about being a refugee. So it'll be on YouTube at some point, so you can all share it, but really a very special song for us at the Migration Summit. So my name is Lorraine Charles. I'm the Executive Director of NAML and one of the co-chairs of the Migration Summit. The Migration Summit 2023 is organized by the MIT React, NAML, Karam Foundation. It's a month-long global convening designed to build bridges between diverse communities of displaced learners, universities, companies, social enterprises, policymakers, employers, and governments around the key challenges and opportunities for refugee and migrant communities. This year, we're exploring the theme, co-creating pathways for learning, livelihoods, and dignity. This panel is about digital freelancing and digital employment. It's going to take a much more broader look at not just refugees, but sort of what does this digital freelancing space look like and what is the future? We know the global demand for online freelancing has increased exponentially. Yet it is still a problematic space. Inconsistent pay, lack of regulatory control, and benefits for freelancers. Sometimes this work isn't viewed as decent, yet it holds significant promise. So let's learn from our panelists about this. Before I begin, I'm going to introduce you to our moderator and dear friend. I love when I introduce friends, Angela Solomon. Angela is a social entrepreneur, an amazing social entrepreneur, multiple entrepreneur, and her company AMS has been supporting communities and strategy for strategy-driven organizations since 2016. Angela, over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be introduced by a friend and a real honor to be moderating this session. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, a really, I think, impressive lineup. Thank you very much to you all for being here. And then we'll move on to discussing these topics. So Albert Azis-Clauson has built his career around the future of work and around providing education and infrastructure to build a freelance business to hundreds of thousands of people globally through Underpinned, while building frameworks of best practice through the Association for the Future of Work. And among people in this ecosystem, Albert, you, I know, have really thought about, investigated, and really interrogated the space around digital freelancing and livelihoods. So we're really excited to hear more from you. I'll also introduce Maria Prieto. Maria, thank you for being here. Maria is an employment and future of work specialist in the ILO, the International Labour Organization, in their employment policy department. Her current work focuses mainly on the implementation of the ILO's Youth Employment Action Plan 2020 to 2030, as well as on the digital transformation in the context of national employment policies. Previously, Maria worked as a specialist in the ILO's Future of Work initiative, where she provided technical support to the Global Commission on the Future of Work and to the work of the ILO on the subject. And the Global Commission on the Future of Work has been highly influential. Maria, we're so lucky to have you here. Thank you for joining the panel. And thirdly, and certainly not least, Michelle Lee founded Young Tech Leaders of the Middle East, YTL, in 2020. It's a technology leadership program to empower refugee and conflict-affected youth from the Middle East to become effective leaders in tech. She's currently working towards her PhD in sociology at Northwestern University, researching how technology is changing the economy and society with a focus on displaced communities. Michelle, thank you very much as well for joining us today. And to everybody else who is not on the panel, there'll be plenty of opportunities, we hope, for you to give and share your experiences. And we want to start with a small poll. You might have seen it pop up on Zoom. We're very intrigued to know, are you joining as a freelancer, as a company hiring? Please put your vote in here. And if you're not, and you're joining in some other capacity, then let us know in the chat. Sonia will be moderating the chat throughout and is very keen to hear from everybody. So then let's move on to discussing. So we decided to structure this session in two parts. We want to start with, as Lorraine has said, with a broad view of the digital freelancing and digital livelihoods kind of situation globally, looking at how the changes in the digital freelancing space are playing into the future of work and the trends that are emerging, and how the policy environment can be impacting and facilitating this or not facilitating it. The second part will be more looking at the underrepresented talent and the opportunities that might be presented by digital freelancing for underrepresented talent, particularly in the Global South and particularly refugees. So if that's what you came to listen to and talk about, hang on for the second half. First of all, we want to set the context. So Albert, I'm going to come to you first, really, to kick us off. Can you tell us a little bit about the background of digital freelancing globally, how you think this links to the future of work, and maybe a little bit about how you see the future, the opportunities and challenges of digital freelancing? And of course, we want to hear what your organisation does. So it's like 100 questions in one.
Yeah, that was a lot, but I will try my absolute best to be as clear as humanly possible. Thank you very much, Angela. That was a fantastic introduction. I wish everyone introduced me so articulately and with such bravado. So I'm a bit under the weather, so I'm sorry if my voice is a bit hoarse. I built my career helping freelancers, as you said, really focused on both freelancers and startup founders, but underpinned the company that I run helps hundreds of thousands of people a year build successful freelance businesses with a real focus on how do you build the business bit around your craft. And I think it identifies one of the really clear problems in the future of work, which is this, what I would define as the defining characteristic in what is changing with the future of work, which is a movement away from time-based, role-based hiring to skill-based, objective-based hiring. And what that means, whether that's for freelancing or for full-time employment, is that employers generally, or at least the most successful employers, are having a greater focus on setting a series of objectives and then finding skills that can help them fulfill those objectives. Now, that's very different to the historical kind of Victorian mechanistic format of hiring, which is we're just kind of starting to come out of, which is really focused on we hire a role as a very long-term process. It's part of a ladder where you slowly climb out through a whole series of roles. And that leads to a whole series of opportunities, but also a whole series of problems. So to take a couple of steps back, we really focus on helping build that kind of business articulation, which is a lot about how do you build a commercial proposition? How do you talk about yourself in a commercial context? How do you take what are not inherently commercially valuable skills, particularly creatives, but that can be anything from engineering through to design work, and you learn how to contextualize them within a commercial space. And that's a really important skill set that we're seeing most people don't get access to, particularly during normal linear education. And so we're seeing a huge number of people come out of education, wherever they're from globally, with these amazing skills. And the quality of education has improved drastically. The quality of academia for academia's sake has improved drastically. But the access to this kind of how do you commercialize or build propositional value around these skills hasn't really developed at all, which is where Underpin has been particularly successful alongside the kind of software infrastructure that we've built. But to talk about the kind of global context, I think the two really important trends for me, after you look at that kind of key fact around skill-based, objective-based hiring, is that there are two major forces at play, which COVID, I think, drastically accelerated. Number one is the push factor from individuals. People have a greater desire to own their careers, to move faster and be rewarded based on the quality of their work and their ability to deliver, rather than their nepotism or ability to stay at one company for a very long time, as well as people wanting to own, I guess, in a sense, the ethical responsibility of the projects that they work for. People want to work for employers that they trust. People want to work on projects that they believe in. People want to feel like they have a sense of buy-in to the work they're doing. And one of the kind of mischaracterizations of freelancers, I think, happens quite a lot, is that they're less bought into a company's mission than employees. And I actually think that that's the opposite. In my experience, all the freelancers I've worked with, and being a freelancer myself, I'm more bought in, and the people I've worked in have been more bought in because they chose to do it. They're not just been given a series of projects to do. So there's this big push factor of people having this kind of general sentiment of, I want to work for myself, I want to be able to have a little bit more ownership, I want to work a bit more flexibly, I want to be able to be paid for my value that I'm delivering and not just for my time. But the problem of how do you actually educate people on how to do that? The other side of it is this pull factor, which is that businesses increasingly use communication technology as their standard form of kind of communication, i.e. not talking to the person next to you, but delivering it via some sort of software system. And increasingly remote teams. And what COVID did, which I think is a really important trend, but not change, is that we had this developing trend of people working more remotely, a more kind of software-based communication system. And what COVID did is it accelerated it massively. Every company in the world had to adopt some sort of software communication as their primary format of communication. Now, what that does that's really, really interesting is that it says, I don't talk to my full-time in-house team differently to how I talk to my temporary freelance employee or temporary freelance worker, which is a drastic change kind of culturally in the way in which we communicate with the people that we work with. Now that alongside businesses having to reduce reliance on in-person meetings, on physical locations, on full-time staff as a whole, as people cut back during economic uncertainty and focus more on kind of project-based teams, that just really accelerated this process of we're not hiring for roles, we're hiring for a specific objective and we build a team around it. Now, we're also seeing at the top companies, particularly in tech, that they're starting to do this even with full-time employees. Their full-time employees move around based on the project's skill requirements. Now, I don't want to ramble on for too long, but I think the key for me here is that we're looking at skill-based, objective-based hiring. We're looking at individuals taking more ownership, and we're looking at businesses looking to build more efficient hybridized teams or blended teams or whatever you want to call it, where there isn't less of a sense of buy-in, but there's a greater sense of focus on how do we deliver on a specific objective. And I think the very final point that I want to make with specific reference to this talk is that there is a massive opportunity within this to go from people-based hiring to work-based hiring. So rather than looking at the person first, like I talked about earlier, this idea of nepotism or staying at a company for a long time and meeting the right people and moving your way up, which we all know networking is still important and will probably always be important. But there is a much greater emphasis on I'm hiring for the skills because I'm hiring for a project, which is a great opportunity to improve accessibility, access to opportunity. But I think to kind of go back to Lorraine's point, while there is a huge opportunity in the future of work to create more accessible horizontal systems that give people better access to opportunity, it is by no means a necessity. I think with any great infrastructural shift, whether that's in policy, ways people are working, or technology, there is always opportunity to improve the status quo, but it is not a default setting that it is improved. And I think conversations like this around how do we improve policy infrastructure, how do we improve education, how do we improve understanding are incredibly important to harness this opportunity to give access to people from the global south, or more broadly, people from areas where they might traditionally have less access, more access. We have to make a very deliberate effort to do so.
Thank you, Albert. Well, it's almost like you knew what my next question would be, because going from the changes that are happening organically in the workplace and the shift towards objectives-based hiring and accessing a more global talent pool, in parallel, of course, there is the infrastructure, the system, the legal context that has to adapt perhaps in line with that. So this is where we should turn to Maria. From the ILO perspective, how do you see the status of digital work globally and the way that is perhaps shaping the future of work? What are the key trends that you're seeing?
Thank you, Angela. I would like to take one little step back just to put things into a different perspective. So there is an ongoing digital transformation. That's a given. But it doesn't happen in isolation. There are other trends that are very, very important and equally influencing what is happening in the world of work. And we're talking about globalization, demographic changes, like an aging of the population, but also geopolitical ongoing issues, the environmental aspect. They're all playing into what is happening in the world of work. Of course, digitalization is an enormous trend and driver of change, if you like, that has to be considered. As Albert was saying, during COVID, I mean, that was another sort of hit or influence to the world of work. Digitalization was used to counterbalance some of the imbalances to it. So there is an ongoing digitalization in all work, in most work, not all, but in most work, most people are facing changes. They can be minimal or they can be maximal. I mean, the complete change in the way they are working through, for example, platforms. But there are also some that are just minimally changing the way they work, adapting to a digital era. No? But what is a common denominator is that there is an increase in productivity as a result from technologies. I mean, it's always been like that. When we discovered electricity, the increase in productivity went through the roof. Every time there is a change in technology, productivity is changes, increases. However, there is not necessarily an increase in income from the other side. And these are the discussions that are ongoing in the International Labour Organization, of course, because our organization looks into or tries to mitigate the imbalances, if you like, between workers, employers, and governments, like this tripartite structure that is constantly negotiating how we work, how much we earn, what are the conditions, etc., and what are the regulations, as you were asking, and it is that question, what are the regulations, is a very sensitive question today, but it's always been like that. Every time there is a change, there is resistance in these three parties that I was mentioning to adapt to this change. The major trends, they have to be seen in coordination with other trends. It's not only about digitalization, but other issues as well. But I will come back to this question later. So I'll pass over to Angela.
Maria, I'm so sorry you were interrupted by those interventions, but what you were sharing with us is really important, to take a wider view, and also that digital livelihoods are part of a wider community, not just one actor, not just the employee or the freelancer, not just the employer, and not just the government. Maybe we can now turn to Michelle and look at this from the perspective of your work and also your research. What kinds of trends on digital work and freelancing are you coming across?
Yeah, I would love to chat about that. So a few things to highlight is that, Albert mentioned that there's kind of this like push and pull factor going on. So with digital work, that there are many different pathways there, both by intentional choice or unintentional result, which I'll kind of chat about in a bit. And also with digital work, we're really seeing this global collaboration. So across borders, like global teams, global communities. And I'd like to share an anecdote that I think really represents that on all fronts. So I founded Young Tech Leaders of the Middle East, which is a tech leadership program for refugee youth in 2020. And that was the middle of the pandemic. So originally the idea was to actually host this program in person in Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And I had partnered with a local nonprofit, Recoded, which some of you may be familiar with, who had an office there. But with COVID, it just didn't feel safe or smart to continue planning the program that way. I didn't want to risk other people getting sick. I, didn't want to force people to have to travel there, especially since Recoded, the nonprofit, had also gone remote first. So I did have to adapt against my will at first, but I realized that going digital actually opened up so many doors for the program and took it in a completely different, but honestly better direction. Because whereas before I wanted to target Iraqi youth and just have this like local ecosystem, now I was actually able to think globally and expand it to youth from all over the Middle East. So like Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, etc. I was also able to invite speakers and mentors from all over the world without worrying about, like the transportation costs and other logistics. So in a way, the changes were actually a blessing in disguise because it did force me to think globally in a way that just made sense for the program. Because if you're training program to work in tech, which is a global field, they will inevitably be working with global teams and having to learn how to communicate across time zones, learn how to navigate cultural differences, learn how to use digital platforms like Zoom, Slack, Miro. So the program pivoted in a way that just made sense when you're working in a space like this. But, when we're talking about why people pursue remote work, I also want to, kind of frame it like we're not just talking about pandemics, that's like an extreme case. We're also talking about people who might struggle with chronic illness and maybe don't have the energy levels to physically go into work, or maybe new parents who have to watch their children part-time. Or really like think of any other life reason, right? Life is messy and things happen. So I really see digital work as a response to the non-linearity and unpredictability of life. It's asking companies to meet people halfway where they are, or it's about empowering people to just pursue a very entrepreneurial, flexible career path. And it's not better or worse than a 9-to-5, like it's just different. And then the other trend I kind of want to highlight is, it's really opening up more avenues for mentorship. So traditionally, when we think about mentorship, like you're thinking about your boss or your manager at your workplace or someone else that you look up to at work. But we don't have to think about that in such a narrow sense anymore. Think about anyone that inspires you. Can you reach out to them via LinkedIn, like set up a digital coffee chat, start to establish a relationship, meet weekly, go to digital forums or workshops like this. And that was something that was really valuable about the Young Tech Leaders program again. We had mentors from all over the Middle East, from all over the world, different backgrounds, cultures, countries, walks of life. And it just opened up so many special relationships between the mentors and youth. So I really see digital work as not just the work itself, it's actually opening up more spaces for communities and touch points. And that's something that's really special. And I think that we should really devote attention to foster, when we're talking about remote work.
Thank you, Michelle. I see lots of participants are nodding. So I think you've hit on some points that are really striking home for a lot of people. I wonder, so I think what we're going to do now is open the chat for questions. So if you would like to contribute and you have joined this session, we would love to hear from you. What do you think are the challenges and opportunities of digital work? And if you would like to put your thoughts in the chat, we will have a look through those and share them with everybody. And if there are any questions coming up, we'll also ask the panelists to answer them. I want to invite our wonderful Lorraine. If you would like to make any comment on any of this, Laurie, please let me know. I see you nodding, but I knew you would be nodding because this is also your field. So please do come in at any point. And maybe I could come back a little bit, Michelle, Albert, and Maria, all of you on this question around mentorship and connection. So we see, of course, digital livelihoods as a way to connect and open opportunities in a wider geographical spectrum than we might be able to access through our physical presence. But we also realize that that means that you have to be a lot more proactive about establishing human connection. So I'm almost surprised, Michelle, to hear you say that mentorship became widened and more accessible through digital means, because I'm also in my role supporting young digital talent in my company, I try to make it very intentional that we create opportunities for mentorship and coaching, because we know that they're not in an office environment, exposed to lots of other people and able to learn from them in the way that I did when my career began, in the early days of using email, and where sometimes I would still get documents sent back to me in hard copy with red pen on them. So in the age of track changes, how do we foster human connection and make sure people get the workplace experience that helps them grow and develop as professionals and as people? And I wonder if any of our panelists would like to comment on that. Go ahead.
I'd love to say something if that's okay. Yeah. So I was going to say, off the back of what Michelle's saying, which is brilliant, thank you. Mentors, collaborators, and peers are the three most important characters in a person's career development. And what that basically means is people who are at a similar stage doing a similar thing that you can kind of, basically they're the three characters you get your validation from and your progression from. And so one of the biggest issues that most people face when they're pulled out of the working environment or traditional working environment is immediately removing those three characters, who by the way look like lots of different things in lots of different ways to lots of different people. They're kind of broad characterizations, but they're really, really important parts of people's development. And there's what you've said, Michelle, is really, really cool, because I've never really heard anyone say that. I think it's a really interesting point, because the second biggest problem we see as surveyed for independent workers of all kinds is loneliness after finding work. And what that means is, it means a multitude of things. It means that mental health issues are much worse. It means access to career development is more difficult. It means validation is harder. It means that everybody has issues with kind of self-confidence. Like no one has ever started their own business thinking they know what they're doing, ever. Maybe a very small percentage of white men, but beyond that, like no one has ever gone into building a business like, I know exactly what I'm doing. And as you progress, what you realize is that nobody really knows what they're doing. And what's really, really cool about this that I think has started to happen in a more structured way and previously happened organically is when you start to think about the world as your potential mentors, collaborators, and peers, there's a really, really exciting opportunity there. And there's an increasing number of platforms and facilitators that are allowing for that progression. And I think the other kind of piece of the puzzle, which is always the difficult thing, is the cultural shift. And I think, as many people have said, COVID is an extreme example of stuff happening, and it's by no means the definition of digitalized work. I think people with disabilities, or people who just want to work remotely, or people who don't want to live in metropolitans anymore, there's lots of examples of why people would work digitally or remotely. But one of the big hurdles that we face whenever you have a big change like this is like, how do you culturally kind of reassess your relationships to potentially being just digital ones, which I think a lot of people struggle with, but is a really important part of this process. Anyway, those are just my ramblings.
Thank you. Brilliant. And Maria, do you want to come in on this one?
In the question of mentorship and connections, I think I work a lot on youth employment issues and policies. And one of the main issues there is that job creation in certain parts of the world are only available when you create a business. And that's, it was mentioned, just it's not so easy. I mean, coming like that and starting a business is something extremely difficult. So many times it's not that we discourage, but you need some kind of experience and connections and mentorship to be able to start and to work independently. And this intergenerational connection is extremely important then, because the digital work is just another form of the same work. It's just the way we work.
Thank you. And I think that's a really great phrase for us to remember, intergenerational connection, which has to happen.
Yes, and sorry, and I wanted to mention that this is one of the most difficult things to create.
Wow. And that's actually brings us to Laura's question in the chat here. So Evan, thank you for being so patient with your hand up. We're going to come to you in a second. We have Laura's question in the chat, which is, how do you think we can get more corporates on board with mentoring more refugees and marginalized communities? Knowing that we have to be intentional and create opportunities for mentorship and connection in this global digital space, how can we do it? Come on, panelists, what ideas ideas have you got? What are your
I
answers?
have one really, really basic thing, which I think has been really powerful everywhere I've seen it done, which is just showing people statistics on how powerful diversity is. And I think that there's a really, there was all these like terrible statistics that came out about women in work in like the early noughties. They were terrible because they were badly organized, not because they were bad statistics, which was all about like having women in positions of power was a really positive thing. And it is. And I think like one of the things we talked about offline before this, we talked about last time, was all about not looking at diversity or helping refugees as giving people a leg up. And that this whole idea of like, we need to get more women into the workforce because we need to help them out, which is an absurd concept and narrative. We need to get more diverse people, a greater level of diversity into the workforce because it is more efficient, better, and positive. And I think as much as there are lots of lovely narratives around it that we can talk about, ultimately, when you're talking to the C-suite of like very, very bottom line driven companies who have a huge number of stakeholders they need to justify decisions to, it's not a matter of, is this a positive thing to do in terms of how it feels? It's like, no, this is statistically a positive thing to do in order to make sure that we are still part of this global narrative. And I think I saw a really good campaign which perfectly epitomizes this, which is like, there's a big backlash in the US against woke companies. There's all these like absurd videos of people buying loads of Bud Light and shooting it with a machine gun, which is ridiculous because they're spending a lot of money on the Bud Light they're destroying. But the whole purpose is like, we're not going to support woke companies because they don't realize like we're their main customers. It's like, no. These companies are multi-billion-dollar companies who have invested huge amounts into user research to work out who their customers is. And you know what they've worked out? Being sensitive and inclusive is a positive commercial narrative. And I think that the more we talk about it as not about giving refugees and people from diverse backgrounds a leg up, and the more we talk about it as, no, we need diversity in order to be successful and to improve our efficiency, the better. And I think that there is always going to be a bit of a gap. There are always infrastructural changes required in internally in companies to facilitate those kinds of interactions. But then ultimately, the long-term trajectory of them is ubiquitously and unanimously positive.
Yeah. And that's so important to remember. Thanks. Okay, Michelle, we'll come to you, then Evan, and then back to the chat.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Albert, about like the numbers, because I think it's important to think about the audience you're speaking to and the language they speak. And I mean, the good thing is, like diversity, like, hiring people from different backgrounds is a win-win-win, right? As you said, like there's so much research, academic and industry research showing that, diversity, like diverse teams, diversity in executive leadership teams, especially does improve like the revenue, the bottom line, the innovation rate, the types of products and services you're creating. So one part of it is finding the framing. Although, the cynical part of me is also like, it's not just about the numbers. Like there's obviously like, you're creating like a different environment, human relationships, when you do, open up the doors to different backgrounds. But the other thing is also finding your advocate, the person to really be on your side when you approach these companies, because like when you think of a corporate, like that's very intimidating, like that's a huge institution. But I think it's important to think about the small steps. So like I used to work for a corporation as well, or like a large tech company. But within that tech company, there's a lot of different small divisions. And I think it's about finding the right department and the right person who can really, again, be your advocate and spokesperson, and just starting small from there to create some sort of, project or initiative together. So yeah, I think it's like, speaking the right language, finding the right person, and then just, taking one step at a time that way.
Thank you. And clearly the way we're going to find the right person is we're going to use a digital tool probably to find them inside a company. So there is the end of the snake eating its own tail. Thank you. Evan, thank you for being so patient. I'm going to ask you to unmute and then make your question now. Oh, where have you gone? Here.
Hello. I have a little question about what companies might owe freelancers. So one of the bargains of full-time employment in the past was things like coverage, pensions, other perks and bonuses, and support that the company provides you. The companies would also provide trainings, upskilling within the company. So what should companies do to support their freelance employers, and so it doesn't just turn into some recyclable commodity?
Thank you. This is a topic we really wanted to cover, so thank you, Evan, for bringing it onto the agenda. Yes, okay. I think the man to answer this question is Albert. Would you like to take it away?
I definitely don't have the final answer to this question. I think that what's really important to me is that we introduced the kind of triplet relationship that Maria brought up earlier. This is about a relationship between three key stakeholders, which are policymakers, the businesses doing the hiring or requiring, I think is a better phrase, and the individuals. And I think that it's one thing to say, what do we owe as a company to hiring freelancers? It's another thing, it's like, how can we facilitate the most successful interactions? Which I think actually, again, like, to be really cynical, Michelle, apologies, to just talk about money and bottom lines, it's a lot of how these big businesses are making decisions, which is, how do we access the best talent? Now, one of the really interesting points is, if you look at high skilled freelancing, which makes up a majority of the GDP, the GDP of the global freelance economy or the global independent economy, these are people who have left full-time work because they can make more money and work on more interesting projects and do more interesting stuff by working for multiple people over the course of the year. And how do you get access to that talent? Well, you have really interesting and fair and accessible systems of work. And so you are forced to produce better systems. Now, these are people who generally need slightly less upskilling. They're people who generally need slightly less benefit support, obviously, because they're generally being paid very well. And so those problems are kind of lessened in their other systems and usually pay-based. But more broadly, what do we need to do? I think there's a few really clear steps that need to be taken. Governments need to invest in better education around the professionalization of skills. Like, that is a basic, simple thing to do. I think everyone I know who is at any forefront of any industry talks about the fact that we don't really, from primary education, secondary education, high schools, universities, ever really talk about how to commercialize what we're doing, how to professionalize what we're doing, how to package what we're doing, how to talk about it in a sensible way. That doesn't just need to be a cynical commercialization of your skills. It can also just be about how to contextualize your skills within other verticals and other areas. So I think that's a really big one, is improvement of education. Number two is looking at employment status and tax. The bifurcation of employment status, and some places has been turned into 3 different statuses, is incredibly complex, difficult to navigate for businesses, and expensive to navigate. So compliance needs to be reduced by policymakers. And we're starting to see that happen in places. There's a couple of European countries that are doing quite a good job. Sweden, Estonia are doing quite a good job. But broadly speaking, it's incredibly complex and expensive. So policymakers need to look at how do we sort that out. And a big part of that is, how do we improve tax systems so that we're not losing out on tax while we're building these systems so that it's fair and accessible, and companies can ultimately access it. Then I think the second bit is that there will probably be a much greater impetus and requirement for private companies to step in on benefits. But I think, again, that's where policymakers need to have a really conscious oversight of how can we make sure there is a minimum standard that people have access to. I personally am a big believer in national benefits and kind of nationalized healthcare systems. But realistically, I think it's probably not going to happen in the majority of places in the world. But there are a lot of interesting tech-led solutions that are allowing the introductions of these benefits. And then finally, on individuals, which again comes from education, but individuals understanding what they should have access to. I think one of the biggest scourges of this, that's not the right word, one of the biggest awful things that's happening in this area is free work. Like, people working for their portfolio, or people working to prove themselves. Like, you would never get a full-time job for a year and not get paid to prove yourself that you can get a full-time job. I think that education at earlier stages needs to improve how people feel about their value of their skills, which comes from an understanding of how to professionalize and commercialize. So sorry, a really, really simple answer is it's going to be a joint effort from all 3 stakeholders. But I think if we rely on companies, all they're realistically going to do is look at how can we acquire better talent, which comes from having better offerings.
Thank you. And Maria, you've really sort of shaped the discussion by pointing out the triangle of the different stakeholders in this. I'm going to come to you now, actually, because it would be great to hear a little bit from your perspective about the existing policy frameworks that are or are not facilitating digital work, and how they may or may not be protecting both those who do the work and the companies who are hiring. Maybe you could say a little bit about the policy environment and frameworks.
Sure. So today we do not have any labor standard that includes the word, that is towards digitalization. So the discussion now that is ongoing in the international labor conferences, etc., highlights the necessity to arrive to an understanding. But at this point, the discussion, particularly coming from the employers part of is that we have so many conventions, etc. So many labor standards that should be included in any digital work. So we shouldn't change those. However, the other two do feel that there is a need, workers and governments, to have some kind of international discussion. Normally how it happens is that in the labor conference once a year, conventions are discussed and agreed upon between the three parties. And when they are signed and agreed, then it goes down to national level and they're signed off in the best of cases. So the decision taken, I think, a few weeks ago was that in 2025, there will be the first standard setting discussion on digital work. Until then, the recommendation is to adapt in every country the other regulations that can be adapted in terms of hours of work, etc. All this leave, maternity, all these things. But there is another issue that is extremely important that I might discuss it a little bit later on, and that is the issue of informality. So you can only regulate formal employment, obviously, and informal work that is a very, very big part of the global world of work. In countries in Africa, they go from 60 to 90% of the labor market. There, the discussion is a different one. So I hope that was clear.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And I mean, amazing to hear that there will be, international engagement on the changes that are going to be needed. So our excellent chat moderator, Sonia, is going to read out some of the questions that have been asked in the chat. Sonia, over to you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to start with Ed Fraser's question, as it is a very good one. So, how can we ensure digitalizing roles, especially favoring freelancing over traditional employment, and doesn't exacerbate but actually confronts existing disparities in opportunity and exploitation of workers' rights? If anyone would like to take this one.
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, I feel like we all may have some comments to make on this excellent question. I will perhaps start with, we'll try and be relatively brief on these because we're going to move on to section 2 in a second. So I think maybe we do Albert and then Michelle and then Maria on this question, if you want to.
I want to hear from Michelle first because I want to steal her thoughts and then make them
Okay,
mine.
perfect.
Absolutely. Happy to jump in. I mean, my first thought here is like, this is where the really networks of support come in, and like having these types of like programs and communities that are geared toward maybe like women or people of color or refugees, like specific communities where you can really share cultural specific resources. And I do see a lot of move toward this. I know like NOML, CONCAT, Recoded, like a lot of the programs we see nowadays, I think have this focus on like, we're not just talking about setting up some neutral tech network here. Like there is a known inequity, there is a known imbalance. So it's really about having mentors, like, mentors who can support someone else who's gone through that experience, or having, what does it mean to be a digital freelancer when you're competing in a marketplace with established freelancers who are maybe predominantly male or coming from specific regions of the world or something. So yeah, my initial response is kind of just like really setting up these robust networks of mentorship and cultural specific resources.
Thank you, Michelle.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Albert, thanks.
I got overexcited. I really like that, Michelle. I think like definitely there's a huge part around creating more interactions, not less, as like a big part of something from. I just want to make 3 very specific points, which are, the first 2 are slightly opposite. One is the use of private networks, which is that most successful freelancers are successful because they have a private network of people that they get the vast majority of their work. Bearing in mind, 80% of the global freelance work is done direct to source, meaning only 20% of the work is done via mediators like platforms and marketplaces. So looking at how we develop those private networks is really important. And a big part of that is around education and what Michelle is saying, which is just introductions, like making people feel comfortable possible communicating digitally. Number two is the increased importance of mediators, which is things like platforms, marketplaces, communities like this, who are putting standards in place between those interactions, which in some cases are not formalized at all, but in all cases can be done more informally. The third point is to question the use of the word roles. And I think this is a really, really important point. You've suggested in that first part of the sentence, I'm not sure if this was intentional, that we're replacing like a long-term role with potentially freelancers. And I think that is not true, in my personal opinion. At least, I think statistically also not true. But the point being that what we're actually doing is we're replacing roles with a series of tasks that need to be completed. Within that, I think there is a massive opportunity to significantly reduce disparity by focusing on what skills are needed to specifically solve the problem of those tasks, and then looking to private networks and mediators to make sure that we can start filling those gaps. And if you are hiring somebody from the other side of the world, it doesn't matter if it's a shorter term period of time where you're focused on a piece of work rather than on a long-term relationship of an employee-employer relation.
I think there's something, I mean, if I might just add a point on, many of the people here are freelancers themselves. So perhaps you, like me, have had an experience like this where becoming a freelancer is great in many ways. We've discussed a lot of the positives, but there's also that flip side that you then take responsibility for lots of things that an employee wouldn't have to think about that much, like a pension and unemployment protection and sick pay and maternity leave and those kinds of things. In some places, we're lucky enough to have some state coverage for those, but in many places, not yet. So I think that, Ed, your question is really interesting because it's not just about kind of the regulatory system, it's also about being an informed freelancer and knowing what you have to take care of yourself so that you don't lose out on some of those things that are oriented towards your future. So you're not just taking what's happening today, but you're able, informed and educated to plan your future. And I, maybe as one case study, had a really great education, every opportunity, grew up in the global north, really can't complain about anything, and yet struggled with the transition to freelancing because of some of those structural issues that I wasn't well informed about. And I suspect there may be others who've had similar experiences. So I think, yes, if freelancing is an alternative system to address inequality, then you have to also address that information gap across the piece. And Maria, would you like to add any thoughts on this question before we move on? We have one more question and then we'll move on to section 2.
In the issue of discrimination and exploitation, in addition to what you all mentioned, which is completely, I completely agree, there are some, we have noted some complaints, or I don't know what to call it, but some issues on the programming of things, that the logarithms themselves can be discriminating because they are programmed by a particular type of person. It's not that they are racist or pronounced, but they are not inclusive enough because they don't have the information, the global information. So normally the programmers are young, often male, in a certain part of the world. So there is a lot of work ongoing on how to make the actual logarithms more inclusive and less discriminatory. That, I think, is a very interesting work that is ongoing.
Thank you. Yeah, and crucial to so much of what the future might look like, in fact, is being able to put the right inputs in. Thank you. Well, I think this brings us on to one more question that Sonia will share from the chat.
So the next question is Dr. Eli's question. She says that she mentors and supports several CBO leaders, and one of them provides digital skills for the youth so that they can work remotely. And then the graduates of the programs are having difficulty finding remote jobs through platforms such as Fiverr, as you know. So they are unable to compete globally with more experienced remote workers. So the question is, are there any platforms available for the newbies or those who are trying to break into the remote work world?
Great idea for a startup. Thank you very much, Dr. Elaine. So our panelists. I think we've previously discussed the pros and cons of some of these platforms, and I've heard the words race to the bottom used in relation to them. So I don't think you necessarily have great fans of Fiverr and Upwork and the like in this panel. Perhaps we can say a little bit about that and what could be the opportunities for new people sort of beginning their careers as remote workers with less experience. Who would like to come in on this, please? Feel free. Go ahead, Albert.
All right. I love to talk. Please tell me to shut up at some point. We train 250,000 freelancers a year who have literally just started their careers, some of whom are straight out of university or out of school, some of whom are transitioning from full-time work to freelancing. The big initial hurdles that we are trying to help them surmount are, one, thinking about themselves like a business, not a profession. You don't sell skills, you sell a solution to a problem. Your skills are now a toolkit, because you're not going to be told what your jobs are. You're going to have to create jobs in order to fulfill an opportunity for a business. Two, who do you talk to? The collaborators, mentors, and peers that we talked about earlier. And then three, access to infrastructure. How do you actually facilitate doing these things? I know that 90% of freelancers who operate outside of platforms do it without a contract. That's not because they want to, it's because they don't know how to, they don't have access to the system. So we created, as part of my work with the Association for the Future of Work, a global standardized contract for freelance to SMB work, and then clauses for enterprise to freelance work, which we provide electronically for people to use really accessibly. Well, I want to give a really specific example, which I think shows the issues with Fiverr, Upwork, etc., who, by the way, are the people who are likely to solve the problems in this space. So while there are lots of issues with them, I spend a lot of time talking to them, and they have a huge number of people who are trying to do very positive work in this space, and we definitely shouldn't throw them under the bus because they were set up within a market that needed something very specific. But here's the specific example. You look at your business partner, you say, hey, do you know a graphic designer? And they say, no. So you put an ad up on Fiverr and 100 people apply. The alternative is you say, hey, do you know a graphic designer? Yeah, I know someone called Sarah. Hey, let's have a conversation with them. Who would you rather be? One of the 100 people applying for that job, or Sarah? And it's a really, really key example that we talk to a lot of early stage freelancers about. How can you be like Sarah? And that's about building networks. How do you build a network? Well, you need to identify what problems you can solve, who has those problems, and how you can solve those problems. So again, it comes back to that problem of education. What are you actually trying to achieve? And understanding the negative opportunity cost of pitching on places like Fiverr and Upwork compared to building professional networks, which then becomes a bigger problem, particularly for people in the global south, to Michelle's point of how do you find access to those networks? And that is a bigger issue that we spend a lot of time working on, but a lot of it comes from peers and collaborators. It is very rare to meet people, no matter where they're from in the world, who don't, from some format or in some way, have access to the potential of a fully successful freelance career monetarily through people they already know or can access. It's about understanding how to, where to, and what to do in those scenarios.
Thank you. And I should say, to address the balance, that the logo for my company was created by someone on Fiverr. So I have to be grateful to that platform. But then I didn't use it again for various reasons. Thank you. Well, we hope that people can use it for good. And it's great to know that there is a free and open access contract available. Very shocked to know that statistic. Thank you for the question. So let's speak a bit more. I mean, we're going to continue answering this type of question, I think, as we move into the second half of this panel discussion, where we want to be focusing more on underrepresented talent. We're all gravitating in that direction anyway, and I'm really happy that that is the direction of our conversation. So particularly in the global south and including refugees, we want to talk about how digital technologies are expanding access to economic opportunities. Michelle, you've been working in and studying this area. We would love to hear from you. What do you think, or what are you finding from your research about the potential of technology for opening up opportunities to those who need them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing is we want to be intentional about how we describe work in tech. So both the types of opportunities and the types of skills it takes to work in tech. Because often, we talk about it as if it's just coding, like web development or engineering, but tech includes a lot of different types of jobs. So I was never a developer when I worked in tech. I worked in business development, in client relations, managing the relationships and expectations with clients. And then I worked in data operations, where it was more about understanding the data and how to talk about the data to clients. So again, half that job was communications, not tech skills. So I want people to know that like there's different types of career paths. You know, there's like project management, project assistants, marketers, copywriters, human resources, etc., entrepreneurship. You don't need to code to work in tech, although of course, like, you know, it can help for certain roles. So like when I'm usually talking about work in tech or researching this topic, I'm really thinking about the broader landscape here. So like tech as a field that is generally more receptive to remote work, that is generally more global in scope because of the nature of us being connected by that technology. And it often has more of a startup mentality that is welcoming people from different backgrounds and perspectives. So a lot of the curriculum then is training people to be able to work in those spaces. So in other words, you know, to have the soft skills or human skills or cultural capital is the sociology term to like fit into the world of tech. And that's what my program, Young Tech Leaders, sought to do. And that's also what I know like Nomal does and what Recoded and other programs do. They're really training youth or people interested in working in tech in the mindset of tech so that they can communicate professionally, so that they know what their goals are and how to attain them in the space, and that they're familiar with this very specific cultural space, which can ultimately open up a lot of different opportunities for them. So yeah, I just want to reiterate this point, like there is kind of like a hidden curriculum of tech here, and we need to be mindful that, you know, like just be mindful about this aspect of it when we are training or connecting vulnerable communities to opportunities in tech. Like we can't just say like, here are the technical skills and here's the software platform, like go. Like we need to be a lot more intentional about these other skills, other types of opportunities. And most importantly, you know, as I've kind of, you know, said before, like, you know, offer the mentorship and guidance about how to navigate that world. And that human touch point is so important. Because, you know, tech is not just about the technology, you know, it's about this community and this network, as Albert was talking about, like knowing how to professionally leverage that network. And that can be very daunting to navigate for the first time. So having someone who is in that world already and familiar with the vocabulary, the etiquette, the quirks, that is really critical to success, I think. And, you know, that's what part of my research is on right now. You know, I'm researching how networks are created to pass down those types of resources, skills, and knowledge, especially across sectors. So yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Well, we hope you'll be publishing your research so we can all learn even more from it when it comes out. Maria, so we have a question in the chat about informality, something that you raised, and really salient point about the challenges of regulating informality. How do we navigate the large amount of informality in digital work in the Global South?
Well, I think in the Global South, you already have the informality. The digitalization doesn't really affect those numbers. It does affect informality in the North. No? So there is an increased informality in parts of the world that we wouldn't look at normally. And also we need to look at what does informality mean? Is it only not being declared as a worker, etc.? No. So the ILO's recommendation number one is to formalize the informal economy always. However, we have to consider the effects. No, one doesn't want to destroy livelihoods at the same time as you formalize. But in the long run, it would make sense to make sure that work follows with all these benefits that we have been talking about previously. You know, like insurances, etc., leave, whatnot, and it is the only way we know is to formalize so that they can access those benefits. But if you compare before the informality in the global south, because your reference was to the global south, if the change with digitalization, the question is, are they worse off today because of digitalization, or were there the informal work worse off before? If you do interview the workers in the South, many would say that their lives have improved with the access to digitalization. However, they are still informal. So there are many aspects to take into consideration, and to look at not only like a global form of informality, but the different, what it means to be informal or formal. What kind of a value added you get when you go towards formality. And those are the things that we need to address one by one, etc. This is what I've been. But obviously, in any conference or any discussion, tripartite discussion, it is always clear it has to be a transition to formality. Yeah. But if we talk about refugees, that's another issue, because many refugees in many countries do not have a legal right to work. Mm-hmm. So if you do formalize, by default, you will be excluding them from any informal work. So one has to be extremely careful how this discussion is done in those contexts with displaced people, etc., and in host communities, because normally you talk about host communities and displaced people together, but the rights they have in many countries are different, unfortunately, and so that's another issue to consider.
So in a way, the policy needs to follow the result for the individual or for the community, not the other way around. So in making policy in this space, people need to be very careful of unintended consequences that might not be foreseen. Thank you. Great. Does anyone else want to come in on that point? It's such an interesting area. We could probably dive into a rabbit hole on it. So if there are any other comments, very welcome.
I just wanted to make one quick comment, which is that when it comes to formality and informality, it's important to remember two things. One, I think that we very often group together all types of non-employee workers as this like homogenous group of gig or freelance or independent workers, and they're not. There's a huge amount of disparity from a 500 grand a year contractor working with one massive enterprise company a year through to a gig worker doing deliveries, and then a massive tranche of people in the middle, and they all have quite different needs, requirements, and formats for formalization. And I think to think that the person who is doing the contracting for banks is not also doing some informal work is probably also a misunderstanding of the industry. The second thing that I think is really important is that a lot of this informality, particularly in the global north, is driven by a kind of cultural acceptance that freelancing is a thing and that employers don't really need to check, and therefore people who don't really know what they're doing, because most people have never really been formally taught how to build their own business, just kind of give it a go and then don't really formalize parts of their business because it just doesn't really happen as part of the natural process. And I think a lot of the work of the ILO and that we've been building frameworks at the Association for the Future of Work, and lots of people have been working on, it's like, how do we help make the formalization process more accessible and more naturally part of the sequence of events that people enter when they go into doing independent work, which I think it's very easy to say that it's a kind of infrastructural problem, but there's a lot of nuances and cultural aspects to it as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we would like to hear from everybody. So I'm going to ask another open question and really welcome comments and further questions from anyone who's participating. We know quite a few people here are freelancers that also potentially had experience hiring freelancers. So I'm going to ask this question then, Lorraine, I'll come to you to add your comments. So have you hired freelance workers, or are you a freelance worker? And what have been your experiences that perhaps have been touched on by the panel? How do you think that these different discussions have affected you? What's helped you navigate the challenges of freelancing? And what else do you need? What have we missed that, you know, is part of the challenge that needs to be addressed? So we'd love to hear your comments in the chat. And if you would like to add a comment in person, you want to explain it, then put your hand up and we'll come to you. So please think about that and add that in. Lorraine, we'd love to hear from you. Please go ahead.
I just want to touch upon what Albert had said about a lot of the people in the global north and the informality. And we mentioned earlier compliance. Could this be one of the reasons that it's so hard for people to actually understand how to formalize their, perhaps, you know, what is typically classed as theoretically informal work, but doesn't feel that way for the individual because they earn quite a lot? Is it that the compliance issues are so complex that it's really hard for people to navigate that space? Or is it some of the reason that it's hard for people to formalize?
I honestly think it's both. Companies put a huge amount of pressure on workers to work in certain formats because of compliance issues that the companies are facing. And so a lot of particularly high level freelancers will wait to see what the employer says. Like, do I need to be a limited company? Do I need to be a sole trader? Do I need to go via an umbrella company? People get kind of these pushed upon them. And actually what we've seen is when you look at platform work, a lot of the platforms are now starting to partner, particularly because of, I think it's DAX 7 in Europe, they have to partner to make sure that they're doing, that the workers are doing compliant work, partnering with compliance companies like CXC Global and the likes, to make sure that people are kind of fitting into the right categories. I think it is definitely both. Companies are insistent upon certain categorizations for their own risk aversion, and individuals have no idea what they're supposed to be doing because no one's ever told them. And when they are told, it's wildly complicated.
Yeah, and I wonder whether this push toward formalization that's happening in Europe, is this going to disadvantage those in the global south, where formalization is just not possible for a lot of people? You know,
actually, I think not, because the whole point of DAX 7, I think I'm saying it right, I think it is DAX 7, which is the basically European legislation that platforms, marketplaces, the intermediaries will be responsible for the compliance of the individuals on their platforms' work. Now, what that basically means is for people like Fiverr or Upwork, particularly platforms over a certain size, they will become responsible for reporting on the compliance of the individuals within their platforms working with companies. Now, actually, if you're a worker from the global south and you're working via one of those platforms, they have the same level of responsibility if you're working within Europe. It also might allow for areas where compliance is simpler, and we've seen this happen a lot in global south, where the countries have much simpler employment law, where compliance is actually much easier for them to go through because the companies in Europe can hire via a much simpler system. So I don't necessarily think it'll make it less accessible. I actually think it's likely to make it more accessible, but that's with a heavy caveat that there seems to be crazy changes happening in policy in Europe around kind of independent work, which a lot of it doesn't particularly seem very well thought.
Maybe we should just double click on the word compliance and what we actually mean by that. We've talked about employer compliance, we've talked about registration as freelancers and the status that you adopt. What are we including in this murky field?
So the broad categorization of compliance, I think when it's generally talked about within the future of work, is the regulatory requirements of the company hiring the individual, i.e. what do they have to do and fulfill for the hiring process. As was mentioned earlier, if you hire a full-time employee, you have a very clear set of things that you have to do within every economy of what that entails. Within the UK, you have to pay national insurance, you have to allow sick leave, you have to have a certain amount of holiday, you have to pay a certain amount. which actually ironically is the area that's most vague, because there are a lot of junior employees in the UK paid under minimum wage when you account for the total number of hours they actually do, despite the number that they're contracted to do. But what generally I find is what people are referring to when they say compliance is, when you are hiring independent workers, what boxes need to be ticked by the employer to make sure that it is legally compliant work. So in various countries, we have various different formats of independent work. So the UK, the three big ones are via a limited company, as a sole trader, or via an umbrella company, which effectively makes you an employee, but of a third party that is then that you're then hired via. And the compliance is what needs to be done by the employer to make sure that they are legally ticking all the boxes they need to tick. Now, as you can imagine, for a company, that's both an expensive, complicated, time-consuming, and confusing process. And I think there is a general attitude within the people that I talk to that there should be a simplification of this. And the big issue that then arises, which was brought up earlier, is what then are the issues the individuals will face in terms of lack of access to benefits, being a big example, particularly within lower skilled, kind of more price competitive work, where people are being hired and potentially exploited without access to sick pay, without access to holiday, without access to other benefits, despite working ultimately often full-time for a single platform.
Thank you. That's really helpful definition. And maybe it also connected a little bit to Evan's question here in the chat around what's the difference between freelance and entrepreneurship? Because you just mentioned several different types of entities that could be set up by a freelancer as an umbrella or vehicle for their freelance work. And at what point is that a business? And also, as we've discussed, because in the context of your work, Albert, but the idea that entrepreneurship skills are actually a really important part of freelancing. One of my experiences as a social entrepreneur setting up a digital platform for women to access employment as childcare carers, and we found that they needed to learn to market themselves on their online profiles. Otherwise, they may be the best childcare in the world, but they wouldn't get picked by a potential family if they didn't have a nice photo, a good description, previous references. So in a way, with a population with low digital literacy, part of it was about teaching some level of entrepreneurship skill. And actually that's great because it set many of them up for future micro-entrepreneurship opportunities after their work on the platform. So perhaps we would like to take a look at this question here around freelancing and entrepreneurship. And again, in the global south and with marginalized communities, entrepreneurship is often mentioned as an opportunity to catalyze economic activity and generate livelihoods. So I know this has been covered in other sessions in the Migration Summit, but it might be interesting to touch upon it here as well. Do our panelists have any thoughts about that line between freelance entrepreneurship and where might a healthy balance be? Michelle?
I mean, I think there's absolutely a blurry line. And I guess at some point we might question whether we even need to have these like clean categories and if that really serves a purpose. So I mean, yeah, like I think there's an entrepreneurial mindset and an attitude and like how you go about things. And then sure, maybe there's like a traditional definition of an entrepreneur as someone who, goes to investors and asks for funding to start their startup. But as you mentioned, like, anyone can have this entrepreneurial mindset of going out and looking for resources, which doesn't necessarily have to be capital or funding. Like that can also just be knowledge exchange, skill sharing, being able to kind of like tell each other about these are the things that are happening in the space. And I think I really encourage anyone to kind of step into that role and call themselves an entrepreneur and to own that mindset. Like, I don't think that belongs to only a certain subset of people. So yeah, I think freelancers are entrepreneurs. I think, anyone can own that. And I don't know if I actually see a purpose in creating like clean definitions here.
Yes, good thought. Very academic response as well. Let's not be defined by categories. It is more complicated than that. Maria.
Yes, so there are very strict definitions at national level in terms of what a freelancer is or a self-employed person is. You have to register, etc. So normally in most countries, I mean, in the global north, in any case, it would be very defined what you are once you register. your work, and the implications are different, obviously, in terms of tax paying and other issues. So, although I agree that the entrepreneurial spirit is needed for any, to a freelancer or not, there is a legal implication that changes the benefits and all that a lot.
I'd really like to jump in if that's okay, Angela. Maria and
Please.
Michelle, I'd both like to separately talk to you about this because it's something I've been working on a lot. But one of the things I've been doing, and Lorraine has been part of this, with the Association for the Future of Work, is creating a taxonomy for the future of work to create global standards. And a big part of what we did is saying that you're both right, which is a great thing to always do, which is that we created 4 layers of taxonomy. The first of which is a received taxonomy, which is what are people calling themselves? And what people call themselves varies drastically. You can meet 10 people who do, ostensibly the same thing, who describe themselves totally differently. Number 2 was the categorizations of formats of work, which was around we used a kind of Cartesian graph of skill to competition and price, where basically we say, these people are more competitive on time and price, these people are more competitive on skills and communication and network, and how do we define the variations between a contractor, a freelancer, and a gig worker, which were 3 categorizations within those buckets, in order to understand the different formats of work and therefore the different needs they had. Number 3, we had the legal definitions, Maria, that you're referring to, which was a total taxonomy of every country's different legal structures around the definitions of workers and how they should be used. And number 4 was the simplification of it for companies' risk aversion in use of language in contracts, where we use terms like partners, so they weren't attached to those legal definitions, where they would accidentally categorize a worker in a way they didn't want to categorize them. And I think to Michelle's problem, I think what you guys are talking about are 2 different parts to the same conversation, which is how do people work? Well, in a massively differing number of ways, and they think about themselves differently, and we can't really categorize them, but we can learn from them. And then 2, how do we actually impose structure upon that and formalize work? Well, we have to create definitions, and we have some of those definitions, some of which can be improved, some of which are great. And I think what's really interesting is starting to segment the layers of that conversation so that we can have different ways of approaching it. But I would be honored if either of you would be interested in joining in and helping us create this taxonomy in a way that is practically usable in conversations like this.
Absolutely.
Legacy.
I was going to say, I'm so curious to see that taxonomy too. So let's definitely sync up after this.
Brilliant. This panel will live on in the real world, which is fantastic. Well, and also this really brings us on to a final question, after which we'll wrap up. Unfortunately, the time has flown by. So let's look to the future. I mean, as many of these comments have shown, this is maybe an accelerating trend, but something that is relatively new that we are all still adapting to on the level of individuals, on the level of businesses, and also as governments and other stakeholders. So what does the future look like for digital freelancers, especially in the global south? I'm going to open this to our panel and, of course, to Lorraine. But I'd also love for those who are still with us in the session, please also share your thoughts. What does the future look like? Or what would we like it to look like? What is our direction of travel? And are we fine with that? Or do we need to take some action to correct it? So let's turn to Maria. I know you'll have a great answer on this. What do you think the future looks like for digital freelancers?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, I'm afraid, but I can say that unless there is a change in access to infrastructure that makes digitalization possible, so that the global south can access the digital economy just as much as the global north, there will always be a disparity. And that's one issue that is extremely important and that many organizations are working towards, including obviously the ILO, but also organizations, regional and national organizations. I know Lorraine is also nodding away, and yes, this is something that is and obviously the skills that follow that are extremely important to share also with the global South. If this is something that can be improved, because today then the future will be, I think, quite dark. But if we can improve those things, access and knowledge, etc., there can be an improvement in the creation of work, in good work, decent work, and the sharing of this very interesting economy that is the digital economy. This is how I see it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I feel like that's a very honest answer in that it doesn't sweep out any of the challenges, yet it recognises there is a huge opportunity. Thank you. Michelle, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I think like along that vein, as someone who's researching networks, like my response is also from a more like structural level. Like I think what we're moving toward and what we should be building on are these networks of support, which are like most importantly across sectors. So it's not just the private companies, it's not just government. It really is about the big players working together to enact this change. And I know, Maria knows much more about like the policy sphere, but I don't think it's so much based on individuals, but like what can we do to create structures that is about sharing this information and the funding and the knowledge, et cetera. I think it's right to take like a pragmatic approach to it. Like, it's not a magical cure, but I think, if we're able to build out these networks more and more, and there's a lot of people who are doing this work already, we'll get to a place where it can be more equitable and accessible.
Thank you. Albert.
I think ultimately, and unfortunately, I completely echo Maria's position, which is that the future looks not great. But having said that, and with my incredibly overly optimistic attitude towards everything, one of the things we did at the Association for the Future of Work is we segmented this problems into 6 very clear buckets, which are use of language and taxonomy, education, standards and contracts, employment status, tax and international talent, diversity, equity and inclusion, and sustainability. And within each of those, there are a huge number of amazing people, many of which are in this room, building incredible systems and frameworks to improve this. And I think that the really exciting thing that remains whenever there is any sort of infrastructural shift or cultural shift is that there is opportunity to make drastic changes. And with the development of these frameworks is possible. But I think it is anchored on Maria's point, which is unfortunately without a kind of address to the deficit of access to literal infrastructure, it is kind of impossible to imagine a scenario in which equity is reached.
Lorraine, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think we need to get to this equity because just because of pure demographics, because of the talent, 80% of the population in Africa will be under 30 by 2030. With those statistics, plus the demographic changes that are happening in the global north, we will get to a stage where we will simply not have enough people in the global north to do the work. So things will have to change. And I think with this big crunch and crisis, companies will think we need to do a lot more to support communities who didn't previously have access, to give them access, because it's going to be an economic crisis if it doesn't.
Yeah, thank you. We have covered so much ground here. It's so fitting that we're ending on a note around equity of access and infrastructure. We've covered how the many benefits of working digitally and freelancing around the flexibility, the potential increasing productivity, the fact that life is messy and that sometimes you need something different in your life, and having more control over that as an individual is useful. The fact that diversity is not only great for our souls, but also for the bottom line. We have talked about digital work as a concept. It's not homogenous. It exists as a trend in among many other trends like globalization, demographic changes, geopolitical and environmental issues. we've looked at the enabling environment that is needed for digital work, and part of it is the infrastructure that we touched on at the end. Part of it is around education and skills, the professionalization of skills and being able to market yourself as an individual. And we've covered quite some depth around the need for legal infrastructure and regulation of the sector. So around not offering free work, finding other ways around informality, understanding how to offer a fair deal to freelancers as an employer. And the very staggering statistic that 90% of freelancers are not working under contracts, that labour standards may not be well defined in the context of our digital economy. We've looked at some opportunities, especially around networks and access to mentorship. Amazing to see that some of our panelists and others in this session are sharing, creating opportunities to give that equity of access, not just to infrastructure, but also to networks that help to put you in the room as a digital freelancer, and the need for an intergenerational connection so that those who are starting their careers now in this digital economy also have a fair chance at professional growth and to thrive. Thank you so much to our panelists, Albert, Maria and Michelle. Really fantastic to have you all here. Thank you to everyone who participated and to those who answered and asked questions in the chat. I see some really great points here. Those that we didn't cover in this session we'll wrap up and put into the Google Doc that Lorraine has shared there in the chat, so everyone can take away all of what we discussed and any links that are relevant. I hope we'll have the chance to connect. And Lorraine, I'm just going to pass over to you for the final word. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I mean, this has been a fantastic panel. Thank you so much, Angela, Michelle, Marie, and Albert. And, you know, I work closely with all of you, so it's been an absolute privilege to be in this space with you. This session is recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel, so we'll share it again. Thank you. We hope to see you at other sessions of the Migration Summit. Have a really good day. We have more sessions today, so lots more of this. Bye, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.